All right, so this lecture will cover Chapter 9, Lifespan Development. And when we talk about development, we're talking about changes across the lifespan, not just birth to adolescence, but really from conception to death. In adulthood, we tend to see less rapid, but still important changes. And really, development happens in all areas of psychology. So cognitive changes include memory, thinking, and reasoning. Physiological changes involve things like prenatal development and hormonal changes later in life, and social changes include things like attitudes and social skills and how kids react to parents and things like that. In addition, development can be driven by maturation, which is biological development. Kind of everyone goes through this universal process. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways that we can study development. One of them is using longitudinal designs where we have the same participants that you follow at each time point. So we start with a group, and these are groups, even though I've only got one person in this example. We've got a group of people that we test in childhood, which is time 1. We test the same people again in adolescence, which is time 2, and again in adulthood at time 3. And so we can compare how these people change over time. So we have the same participants who are doing generally the same or similar tasks at 3 different time points. So we can see how they change as they get older. Another alternative is a cross-sectional design, where again we start with a group of participants who are in childhood, for example, another group who are in middle childhood, and a third group, and then these are different people in a cross-sectional design, who are in adolescence. And so we compare the early childhood participants to the middle childhood participants to the adolescent participants. So we have one point in time, we've got 3 different groups of kids of different ages. So we can see kind of how age makes a difference in terms of the rates of certain types of behaviors or things like that. We also need to keep in mind genetic contribution. So the mom's egg and the dad's sperm each contribute chromosome, and each chromosome has thousands of DNA segments. We can think about the genotype, which is the genetic makeup of the child, as well as the phenotype, which is the characteristics that we actually see. We also need to remember the phenomenon of epigenetics, which is basically that our genes are flexible and they respond to both internal and external activity. They may change as a result of the environment. It may determine which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. So for example, one classic study on this phenomenon of epigenetics is that mice with genes that make them more likely to be stressed out. If they have supportive mothers, they are less likely to show this stress. Okay. In terms of how development progresses throughout the lifespan, conception is the moment when the woman becomes pregnant, so it requires an egg or an ovum and a sperm, and the combination of the egg and the sperm result in a single fertilized cell, which is called the zygote. A question we often get about this time period is twins. So how do twins come about? So monozygotic twins are identical twins, and here you have one zygote, so one egg, one sperm, that split into 2. So we've got one fertilized egg that splits into 2. Dizygotic or fraternal twins happen when the mom releases 2 eggs and it's fertilized by 2 separate sperm. Often I get asked about whether this is inherited. From what we can tell, identical twins happen at random, but there is a genetic predisposition that makes women more likely to release more than one egg in one cycle, which makes them more likely to have fraternal twins. In terms of periods of pregnancy, 3 general ways we can break it up. The germinal period is really the first 2 weeks, so after fertilization, the zygote travels to the uterus and ultimately implants in the lining of the uterus. So this is very, very early in the pregnancy. During the embryonic period, the embryonic cells kind of differentiate and you start to see the beginning development of major organs and structures. because these important organs like the heart and the brain and the lungs are developing, they tend to be very susceptible to environmental influences. We'll talk about them in a second. And then finally, the final stage is the fetal period, which is really the majority of pregnancy, 8th week until birth. And this is where the baby is growing. Those main organs have been developed. The great baby is growing in length. They're putting on fat and weight to help make them be prepared for birth. So these environmental influences can affect the developing embryo or fetus. So teratogens or any kind of environmental agent that can affect the development of the fetus. So many of them, German measles, which are less of an issue now because we have vaccinations, but they used to create significant problems in terms of deafness, intellectual disability, and heart problems. Radiation and toxic chemicals. So for example, pregnant women need to be very careful about x-rays because we know that they're associated with miscarriage and other abnormalities. This is the reason that pregnant women are encouraged to avoid fish that are high in mercury, because that can lead to problems with the baby. STDs, sexual transmitted diseases, can actually pass through the placenta, and others can be transmitted to the baby during delivery, but we've made some pretty impressive progress here. So for example, HIV positive mothers can actually take drugs that reduce the likelihood that the infant will contract it, and it's possible for an HIV positive mother to have an HIV negative child. Cigarettes increase the likelihood of miscarriage and premature birth. Alcohol is another one. There's no safe amount of alcohol for pregnant women to consume, so it creates problems with intellectual disabilities. There are certain facial features that are associated with fetal alcohol syndrome that you can see in this figure. Also kidney problems, attention problems, and other issues later on. And other drugs cause various different things, but certainly can affect the developing fetus. Once the infant is born, they generally are born with kind of a couple of basic reflexes, but not a lot of control over them. So I've posted videos of some of these on our Moodle page so you can take a look. But for example, the rooting reflex is if you tickle the baby's cheek, they'll turn towards the touch and look for something to suck. Startle reflex, when they're startled, they kind of arch their back and throw their arms out. Grasping reflex, if you put your finger in their hand, they'll grab it. The stepping reflex, if you hold their feet so they're just touching the ground or a table, they'll move their feet in a walking motion. And this is most of what newborns do. Their senses are fairly well developed at birth, but they don't have a ton of control over them or their physical movement either. But as the infant gets a little older, they start to get more control. So they become really interested in novelty because they're trying to learn about the new environment. And really from just a few weeks after birth, they get really interested in things that they can control. So for example, a 2-month-old is much more interested in a mobile that they can kick and control than one that they have no control over. They start around 3 to 4 months. They start really exploring the social world with their mouths because they're not moving yet. But as they get more physically capable, they begin exploring with their bodies as well. And we're pretty naturally social creatures. So babies really heavily depend on social cues and they pick up on them very quickly. So for example, joint visual attention happens around 6 months. So this is when a baby will look at an adult's eyes and see where the adult is looking and follow their gaze to look at the same thing. And so this requires a fair amount of cognitive advancement, but it's really important for them to learn about things like naming objects. Okay, so this is a rough layout of when things develop. The general patterns that we see, and this is in terms of physical development, are that development happens in a cephalocaudal way, so from the top down. You see skills moving and holding up the head develop before fine motor skills in the hands and feet. And then we also see proximodistal growth, which is that kids develop motor control from the center outwards. So things like rolling over involves core muscles, where fine motor skills happen much later. Something to note is that red line there is kind of the time when 50% of kids have reached that, but you see a big amount of variability. So even if we just look at something like walking well, the average age is about 12 months, but there are certainly kids that walk earlier, and there's a significant number of kids that walk later as well. So we have to always keep in mind this variability. Okay, so temperament has to do with kind of biologically based characteristics that lead kids to act in a certain way. Some babies are calm and mellow and easy to soothe. Others are fussy and more challenging. And generally we have 3 types of temperament. So easy temperament, kids are playful, they're okay with changes to their situation, they have regular schedules, things like that. Difficult temperament children tend to react really negatively to new situations and people. They're not very adaptable and they're hard to soothe. And these kids often go on to have conduct problems later on. Slow to warm up kids tend to be kind of cautious or wary in new stimulations or new situations, and they have kind of low activity level, but they do adjust gradually. So that's just a snapshot of temperament. We're basically just very briefly covering some of these concepts in development, but another big one is attachment. So Harry Harlow was one of the first people to start looking at attachment, which is the kind of establishment of emotional bonds with caregivers. And so what he did is he raised these baby rhesus monkeys with these kind of substitute mothers. And each baby was given 2 mothers. The wire mother, which is the one on the left with it, which is just the frame, and then the cloth mother, which was covered in soft material. And what he found was that regardless of which mother actually provided the monkey with milk, they became attached to the soft ones. They would run to if it was frightened, they would cuddle with it, they preferred to look at it. And that really showed that there's something about that physical comfort that babies really depend on. So we define attachment as an emotional bond between an infant and a caregiver. I've got some videos posted on Moodle for you to take a look at. But Mary Ainsworth developed a strategy for testing this called the strange situation, in which basically infants and their parents come to the lab. The infant stays in the room and the parent leaves. They see how the infant reacts. They send a stranger in and see if the infant can be comforted by the stranger, and then send the mother back in and see whether she can calm the infant down. And based on kids' behavior in this situation, she has categorized kids into 4 different types of attachment. So kids with secure attachments are willing to explore when they're in the room with their mom. They become upset when the mom leaves, so that's normal and expected, but they're also soothed by her when she returns. In contrast, we don't always find the same thing with kids with insecure attachments. So kids with avoidant attachments tend to seem unattached and uninterested, so they just don't spend a lot of time with the parent when they're in there. When the parent leaves, they're not that upset, and when the parent comes back, they don't really want much to do with them. Kids with ambivalent attachments tend to be upset when the mom leaves. But when the mom comes back, even though she's the reason that they're upset, they don't seem to be able to get much comfort from her. And then finally, disorganized attachment. These kids don't really show a clear pattern. They seem really scared or dazed or depressed. These are often the children of parents who are abusive or have used drugs or things like that. They're kind of extreme situations. You see this much less often. Generally, we see that secure attachment is associated with positive adjustment. So the idea here is that through an internal working model, your relationship with your parents sets your expectations for the rest of your relationships. So your relationships as an infant with your parents affects how you will behave in your friendships in childhood and adolescence, and how you'll behave in your romantic relationships, what you expect from the other person. And in terms of what creates the attachment, it seems like maternal care is really the most important thing and plays a really big role. In terms of language development, by the time a child reaches 3, they've learned 3,000 words and many of the complex rules of language. So there are some theories that children are born with some kind of biological predisposition to help them kind of absorb this much information so quickly. But the general pattern we see is around 3 to 5 months, we start seeing cooing and babbling, like oohs and ahs sounds. And all kids start off using the same kinds of sounds, so they start with these universal patterns. But by 9 months, they only use the sounds of their own language, which tells us that we go from this universal to a native language specific. So those patterns are in blue on this figure. The orange tells us about how infants listen to and understand language. And similarly, what you see is that kids kind of have this universal interest in language, but as they get older, they really kind of become specific in differentiating the sounds of their native language. We're going to skip this slide. But the point of this is that people tend to engage in infant-directed speech. And it has these very specific characteristics that help kids learn language. And we see it universally in every culture. And infants are really interested in this kind of speech. Okay, so next we're going to talk about cognitive development. The big name here is Piaget. He was a cognitive psychologist, and he was really interested in how kids learn to think. And so he argued that there are 4 stages of development that kids go through as they actively make sense of their environment. He said that kids organize their information, their knowledge based on schemas. So they have these mental representations. A dog is something that's furry and it barks and it has a tail. And they use that to identify a dog when they encounter it in the world. And so if they encounter something new, they have to use one of 2 processes of adaptation. So assimilation is incorporating a new object into an existing schema. So if they see a chihuahua for the first time and they say, well, this looks kind of like a dog, it must be a dog. In contrast, accommodation is altering their existing schema to create new ones to fit. So if they see a cat and it's furry and it has a long tail, but it's making the sound that isn't barking, they need to make the accommodation and create a different category for cats. So the first stage is sensory motor stage. This is from birth to age 2. And here you really, the infant is primarily interacting with things through their senses and through their motor activity. The big thing at the end of the stage is object permanence. And object permanence is knowing that an object exists even when it's not in sight. So a young child, a young infant, you can have a ball and put it under a blanket and an infant will think it's just gone. This is why peekaboo is a hilarious and awesome game in infancy, because they think when they can't see you, you're completely gone. By the end of the sensory motor stage, they understand that even if they can't see you, you are still there. Next, we have the pre-operational stage from ages 2 to 7, and the big thing happening here is symbolic thought. So around age 2, kids are really using words, and so they're understanding that words can represent the world and also that images and symbols can. So this is a really important development in terms of helping us think. Pre-operational kids do have some limitations, so they tend to make mistakes of egocentrism, so they're not good at taking other people's perspectives. So they'll do things like close their eyes and think that you can't see them. They also tend to fail tasks of conservation, which is understanding that simply changing the appearance of an object doesn't change the object's nature. So for example, if you have 2 glasses of water, one is short and fat and one is tall and skinny, you pour it from one to the other, it doesn't actually change how much water you have. But young kids in this stage will say that it actually does. Next, we have the concrete operation stage, which is ages 7 to 12. So these kids have mastered conservation. They're less egocentric, but they tend to be limited to really concrete tasks. So they're not very good at solving abstract problems. They need to have the things right in front of them. Even though they can think about them in a little more advanced way, they need those things directly in front of them. And then the final stage is formal operations, which is basically from adolescence on. And here they've really mastered abstract thinking and logical thought. They can use the scientific method. And this really we see take off with formal education when we're explicitly teaching kids these things. Okay. Finally, one other cognitive developmental theorist is Vygotsky. And so Vygotsky argued that basically Piaget ignored the important role of other people. And so he argued that all learning really happens in a social context, so we have to remember that. So a couple of important things that Vygotsky contributed, the zone of proximal development is basically, he argued that we need to teach kids in the area where they can't do a task by themselves, but they can with the help of other people. And that's what we need to target for teaching. And the way we should teach is a strategy that Vygotsky called scaffolding, where we have a more skilled learner giving support to a less skilled learner. At first, they give them a lot of intensive support, but then they provide less and less support as the kids figure it out over the time. So next we're going to kind of shift to adolescence. So adolescence is the transitional stage between late childhood and early adulthood. The start of adolescence is puberty, where kids are reaching sexual maturity and becoming physically capable of reproduction. So normally this starts around ages 10 to 12, although the timing varies. Generally girls reach puberty or start puberty earlier than boys. But this can also be affected by genetics. There's even some evidence for the environment influencing this. So things like nutrition and living standards and physical activity also influences the timing of puberty. And generally evidence shows that kind of compared to your peers, early puberty is a good thing for boys, but generally is kind of negative for girls. They tend to kind of get engaged with older peers, and it tends to have negative effects on them, where for boys, getting taller and more muscular is a positive thing. In contrast, late maturation for girls is fine. For boys, it tends to be a problem because those boys who are hitting puberty later are smaller, and that tends to lead to more issues for them. We see a substantial number of changes in terms of parent-child relationships and social development in general in adolescence. We do see kind of conflicts increase between parent-child relationships, although they overall stay positive. But we do see that friends and peers become more and more influential, while parents kind of start to be less of the center of a teenager's world. In terms of identity formation, this is one of the big things that happens in adolescence. So identity is kind of your sense of self and who you are. And Erik Erikson was one of the first people to really think about how identity develops. And so he had a lifespan theory that's really not specific to adolescence. But the reason we talk about him here is because the big contribution to his theory was identifying that in adolescence we have a lot going on with identity development. So I've got a video of this that you can watch for more detailed information. But generally he argued that from 0 to 1, kids are in the stage of trust versus mistrust. And it's all about, is somebody there to meet my needs, and can I trust other people? From 1 to 3 years, you get autonomy versus shame and doubt. So it's really about kind of learning to direct their own behavior, being independent, putting on their own pajamas or carrying their own cup, things like that. 3 to 5, we get initiative versus guilt. So this is really where kids are really taking responsibility for their actions and kind of being able to control their own behavior and taking initiative. During the school age, from 5 to 12, you've got industry versus inferiority, and this is kids are really learning many new skills. They're gaining a lot of knowledge and competence. And then here's where we get to adolescence, this identity versus role confusion. And so the argument here is that adolescents are figuring out what are their beliefs, what are their attitudes, what do they want to do for an occupation. And those who succeed in this task end up with a strong identity, whereas those who don't might have issues and confusion. In early adulthood, the goal is about intimacy versus isolation. So figuring out who you want to spend your life with, being in a committed relationship with that person. When we get to middle adulthood and generativity versus stagnation, it's really about kind of creating or producing or maybe nurturing the next generation and really feeling like you've benefited your family and yourself. And then finally, when we get into late adulthood, people are really reflecting on kind of what they've done with their lives. And so there's a lot of wisdom and tranquility, and we want people to have ego integrity, which really means that they accept their life, enjoy their life as it was, and enjoy it, as opposed to despair, where people are really focused on death and emptiness. Moral reasoning is another thing that develops. So moral reasoning has to do with how an individual thinks about moral or ethical decisions. Lawrence Kohlberg is the big name in this, and he basically gave kids, it was teenagers, hypothetical scenarios and asks what you would do and why. So for example, there's a pharmacist who's developed a drug. He's charging way too much money for it. There's someone who desperately needs it. Should he steal the drug or not, and why? And so Kohlberg actually had 3 stages with 2 substages in each, but we're just going to kind of briefly cover this. And so in the pre-conventional stage, people are guided by external consequences. So it's about, will you be punished for it? Yes or no, and that's going to be whether it's right or wrong, or kind of, is it fair? When you get to the conventional stage of moral reasoning, it's about internalizing the social rules. So we have these kind of internal expectations or interpersonal expectations. So you want to do what's right so that you win other people's approval, or you have to do what's right because it's the law. Those kinds of rationales fall under the conventional reasoning. And then finally, the post-conventional reasoning is internalized legal or moral principles to protect all members of society. So this is really bigger picture. I value life above all else. That's all that matters. This is my universal truth that guides me. And so we see kind of a number of cultural as well as developmental and gender differences in how people reason. But generally, it's about kind of what is your rationale for what you say in each of these situations. In terms of kind of middle adulthood, there's still a lot of changes going on, particularly as you get later on. So Erickson kind of highlighted some of the changes we see in adulthood, but there are certainly changes in romantic relationships. And if we look over time, people are marrying later. There are fewer traditional families, things like that, which will impact people. In terms of parenthood, there were initiation into parenthood leads to kind of major changes in schedule, stress, identity, declines in marital satisfaction. So developmental psychologists study how that affects individuals. And then also careers. So 1/3 of people in their late 20s and early 30s completely change careers. So just because you're an adult doesn't mean you are settled in your career. And then finally, late adulthood and aging. As lifespans are getting longer, we're seeing more and more changes in old age. In terms of cognitive change, there seems to be a slight decline in intellectual ability after the age of 60. A lot of individuals, though, function very well into the 90s. So there's certainly kind of evidence for limitations, but we seem to see kind of support for this activity theory of aging in all areas, where basically individuals can minimize their decline with age as long as they continue the same kind of lifestyle they had before. So they need to continue doing things that are stimulating and exciting, and that increases life satisfaction as well as cognitive development. So that is it for lifespan development, and you don't need to see our Moodle page. All right.